This program is made possible in part by the First National Bank of Maryland and the National Endowment for the Arts. Linda Pastan talks with Eavan Boland.
Hello, I'm Linda Pastan, and as part of the series, The Writing Life, I'm going to be speaking with the Irish poet Eavan Boland. Ms. Boland, who is one of Ireland's best and most honored poets, lives outside of Dublin with her husband and 2 daughters, but luckily for us, she spends spring semesters at Stanford University. She's published widely, both in Ireland and in the United States. Most recently, the poetry collection In a Time of Violence and the prose memoir, Object Lessons. Eavan, I've been following your work for years since it first started appearing in the New Yorker, but for those in the audience who don't know it yet, maybe you would choose a poem you particularly like or think is typical to read for us.
Well, I think you do. I think you do remain connected to certain poems and have a feeling for them. And you know, I have a connection to this poem. It's called Love. It's for my husband Kevin, and it just goes back really to one winter, about 16 or 17 years ago, when we went to Iowa, and we had 2 very small children. One of them became very ill there and recovered, and I went back there to read for the workshop about 2 years ago, the Iowa Writers' Workshop. And I was just very touched, remembering that day, meeting Kevin on the bridge over the Iowa River at a time when everything was really in doubt with this little sick child. And the sort of construct, really, the city on which this poem is layered and built is this beautiful book of the Aeneid by Virgil, where Aeneas goes down to hell and he meets his friends and enemies, and they open their mouths to shout to him, but their words turn into shadows because it's hell. And it's just a poem about love and memory. Love. Dark falls on this Midwestern town where we once lived when myths collided. Dusk has hidden the bridge in the river which slides and deepens to become the water the hero crossed on his way to hell. Not far from here is our old apartment. We had a kitchen and an Amish table. We had a view. And we discovered their love had the feather and muscle of wings and had come to live with us, a brother of fire and air. We had 2 infant children, one of whom was touched by death in this town and spared. And when the hero was hailed by his comrades in hell, their mouths opened and their voices failed, and there is no knowing what they would have asked about a life they had shared and lost. I am your wife. It was years ago. Our child is healed. We love each other still. Across our day-to-day and ordinary distances, we speak plainly, we hear each other clearly. And yet I want to return to you on the bridge of the Iowa River as you were, with snow on the shoulders of your coat and a car passing with its headlights on. I see you as a hero in a text, the image blazing and the edges gilded. And I long to cry out the epic question, my dear companion. Will we ever live so intensely again? Will love come to us again and be so formidable at rest? It offered us ascension even to look at him. But the words are shadows and you cannot hear me. You walk away and I cannot follow.
That's a wonderful poem, and of course, applicable to any place and time. But you mentioned in your memoir, we actually said that place was something that language could claim. And I wondered, whether living in the United States part of the year made you more aware of Ireland as your place and more able to write about it, or made you feel more distant from it?
Well, I think that's a really good question. When I was a child, I mean, I was born in Dublin, and I left Dublin at the age of 5, and my father was a diplomat, and we spent quite a bit of time outside of Ireland with very few visits back, and so I came back to the country when I was about 13 or 14 to Ireland. And I found myself suddenly, you know, to use your really lovely phrase there, something, you know, the place that language can claim. And I found myself in a place that my language should have been able to claim, but couldn't really. I had lost a lot of the sort of nicknames by which you know a place and a history, a lot of the sort of shorthand for it. And so I was there in some way as an actual linguistic exile in the middle of my own country. And it was a powerful experience. I mean, it has always kept me as a bit of an outsider in my own mind and in my own language. And being in America for a little part of the year, and in a very, I mean, beautiful part of the United States, connects me back to some of that. And also because some of my childhood was actually spent at school in New York. But it connects me a little bit to the senses of dislocation, which actually sharpen a sense of place.
Let's talk a little bit more about that childhood exile, which interested me a lot in your memoir. Maybe you could read In Which the Ancient History I Learn Is Not My Own. I thought that was a wonderful poem to express the feelings of exile.
There actually was, when I was a child in school in London, a very big linen map of the kind you wouldn't see anymore, but one of these sort of cracked linen maps, which still had the old configuration of the red parts of it with the British Empire. And so this is really what the poem came out of, In Which the Ancient History I Learn Is Not My Own. The linen map hung from the wall. The linen was shiny and cracked in places. The cracks were darkened by grime. It was fastened to the classroom wall with a wooden batten on a triangle of knotted cotton. The colours were faded out, so the red of empire, the stain of absolute possession, the mark once made from Kashmir to the oast barns of the Kent coast south of us, was underwater coral. Ireland was far away, and further away every year. I was nearly an English child. I could list the English kings. I could name the famous battles. I was learning to recognize God's grace in history. And the waters of the Irish Sea, their shallow weave and cross-grained blue-green, had drained away to the pale gaze of a doll's china eyes, a stare without recognition or memory. We have no oracles, no rocks or olive trees, no sacred path to the temple, and no priestesses. The teacher's voice had a London accent. This was London, 1952. It was ancient history class. She put the tip of the wooden pointer on the map. She tapped over ridges and dried out rivers and cities buried in the sea and seascapes which had once been land, and stopped. Remember this, children, the Roman Empire was the greatest empire ever known, until our time, of course, while the Delphic oracle was reckoned to be the exact center of the earth. Suddenly, I wanted to stand in front of it. I wanted to trace over and over the weave of my own country, to read out names I was close to forgetting: Wicklow, Kilrodery, Dublin, to ask where exactly was my old house, its brass 1 and 7, its flight of granite steps, its lilac tree, whose scent stayed under your fingernails for days. For days, she was saying, even months, the ancients traveled to the oracle. They brought sheep and killed them. They brought questions about tillage and war. They rarely left with more than an ambiguous answer.
There are various kinds of exile, and it occurred to me that in the Irish tradition, even for women, there's such a strong sense of poetry being important, whereas in this country, to be a poet is, in a sense, to be a kind of exile in your own country. And I wondered if you felt the difference in the two cultures in terms of how they reacted to poetry.
I think there is a difference. I think that differences are hard to put into words, and even when you put them into words, it's not always easy to analyze them. The background of a lot of Irish poetry, I think, remains the sort of bardic model. I mean, the bards of the 18th century, and indeed before that in Ireland, were very communal figures. You know, they had a lot to do with the development of a community and the information of a community and the scandal of a community and the gossip of a community. And those bards wrote songs for christenings and weddings, and, you know, they wrote invective for their patrons. And, you know, the Irish people haven't really let that go. I mean, there's a connection between poets and a public in Ireland that is communal. And I think there are very good things about that. And when I came to the United States, I mean, I have always loved American poetry. And I've followed it very much and been very enabled by it. But the isolation of the American poet, which was very often referred to by poets themselves, began to be very interesting to me, and began, I thought, to be associated in my mind with the fact, I think, that there's a lot of experiment in American poetry, which has to come from the fact that the American poet has broken in their mind some of those links with the community, broken some of those contracts with the audience, and is free to experiment, but also free, I think, to feel more lonely.
So that you think, in a sense, the difficulty of some of the experimental poetry might have, in part, caused this lack of communication between people and their poets?
I mean, being Irish, I would be very diffident from an outside point of view of knowing which was cause and effect. But I certainly do think that the power of American poetry is fairly closely linked, not only to ideas of poetry and experiment, but the crucial idea in two different countries. Who exactly is the poet? You know, exactly who is an American poet, exactly who is an Irish poet. I think the American poet has been not unlike the American model in some other historic examples, the astronauts, the pioneer. I think they've been innovative, adventurous, single-minded, isolated, in ways perhaps Irish poets haven't been.
You did speak of how difficult it was as a woman in Ireland to write particularly political poetry, as if the fact that Ireland was so often personified in male poetry as a woman, that made it particularly hard. That really interests me. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Well, yes, Ireland's not the only European countries, but it's one of them, to in its literature in the 19th century, to have made quite a feminine icon. Its writers made quite a feminine icon of Ireland herself. You know, Kathleen Ní Houlihan or the Sean Van Vogt. I mean, these were figures which put together the national and the feminine in a very romantic way. And it's romantic in the poetry of the 19th century, but when you get right up to the 20th century, and you were like I was, I mean, someone living in a house in a neighborhood with two small children, it became a very sort of stifling figure to deal with. And I mean, I've said it before, but it is true that when I was young, I mean, it was easier to put a political murder into the Irish poem than to put a washing machine into it. I mean, the space was not there for the ordinary and the daily in the way it needed to be.
Right. You mentioned reading Sylvia Plath and Adrienne Rich. Were these American women influential in terms of opening up subject matter like washing machines and one's body and such that
Yes, I think they were influential in both those ways, but they were also, I think, influential because they were political poets in a certain way. And they were not making political poetry out of the public event. They were making it out of the private felt life. And that was very important for me.
Right. I had noticed in reading your poetry through the collections that some of the earlier poems, such as Ode to Suburbia, had a kind of edge to them, whereas some of the later ones, like Domestic Interior and This Moment, had almost a glow to the domestic life. And I wondered if perhaps you could read us This Moment and talk a little bit about how your changes in attitude towards the domestic as a subject.
Well, you know, I suppose I think of it, whether I'm right or wrong, as two sides of an argument, two sides of a dialogue that have been there in my mind. This Moment, I suppose, is different from the Ode to Suburbia, which was, as you say, a sort of earlier, sharper poem in which I had more of a sense of the dangers of the domestic and of subject matter. I think This Moment is a sort of concealed elegy. And, you know, it's about this street where I live, where my children played on, where the moments that sort of go by very rapidly, where, you know, you lift a child and take it in at twilight, just is routine one day, and then the next becomes a lost ritual. And so this is This Moment. A neighborhood at dusk. Things are getting ready to happen out of sight. Stars and moths, and rinds slanting around fruit, but not yet. One tree is black. One window is yellow as butter. A woman leans down to catch a child who has run into her arms this moment. Stars rise, moths flutter. Apples sweeten in the dark.
That's a wonderful poem. Your poems are quite visual. They have paintings in them, they have colors in them. Do you often start with a visual image or with an idea? How does a poem begin for you?
Well, my mother was, a painter. She studied in Paris, and she had a very strong sense, which I'm not sure I would have had in the same way without her, of color. And, you know, I think it's Matisse in an essay, I won't quote right, you know, who speaks about, you know, color as having a sense of argument and a emotion just on its own. I think I don't think I have a sense, if you like, of the visual in a clear and formed way. But in an odd way, you know, I come from a country where there has not been nature poetry as such. You know, Ireland doesn't quite have a tradition of nature poetry. Many complicated historic reasons, including the fact that the land was a powerful and sort of rather broken-hearted place. And I would never have been a nature poet. I mean, it would not have been my way. And so in some ways, I think I became a sort of, by default, indoor nature poet. And I had a sort of sense of, you know, lights and objects and the sort of rather transforming power of the way something looked. And sometimes that was the way, you know, a poem would start.
You also used the phrase that solitude is a forcing house of perception. I know I live out in the woods because I feel the need to have a lot of space and a lot of solitude to get any writing done, and yet I also feel quite ambivalent about that and quite lonely, and I wondered what a Dublin suburb was like in terms of solitude and sociality in terms of writing time.
In some ways, I suppose, I was influenced as a young poet by the way painters worked. I mean, I was impressed. I mean, I was connected as a young poet, at least obliquely, to a very powerful and sometimes rather, I thought, overheated writing community in the terms in which they did their writing or didn't do their writing. Whereas, you know, painters are rather unfussy about all that. They get up in the morning and they paint if they have enough light. And I liked that, and I also thought it fitted rather well with having young children, having a family. So I live in a suburb where, you know, I've been there for 25 years with the same neighbors and the same street, and it's a convivial but not crowded place. And of course, it's a place now that's hard for me to separate out from all its memories and its images.
We're talking about visual things. I always find it quite odd when people ask me if I write on a typewriter or with a pencil on a word processor, but there are so many references in your memoir to have the actual handwriting looks on the page. I think you said once the elements of magic in the handwriting, that I wonder if, out of curiosity, if you do still use just a pen and a paper when you write your poems.
I think I've had a proportion almost all my working life of about 70% is handwritten. It's been a very small, marginal grief to me that for some reason in my life I never ever developed good handwriting. And I don't to this day, and it's one of the things I covet when people have good handwriting. I don't have it. And many people I know have it, but I don't. But I do. I do about 70% of what I do by hand. 30% I put onto computer. I happen to be one of the few poets that I know. I have a great love for computers. And I think if I had been very young and it was a different world, I would have loved to program. And I'm interested in syntax, and an enormous amount of the connecting corridors of poetry and the computer is syntax, and I'm touched by that. But I do have no difficulty using that other 30% as I once used a typewriter.
Right. How about the fact, and this was true in my writing life too, that the earlier poems tend to be much more formal in terms of rhyme and meter and such, and have gotten freer as time went along. Do you think that that's because of the change in subject matter, or a kind of rebellion against form, and do you still write some formal verse?
Well, again, I think that's a sort of fascinating question. No, I think what every poet does, it's less visible because the way we've thought about form in this century, actually every poet, if you look at them, if they write for a continuous amount of time, open a dialogue with their own formal background. They open that dialogue with their own formal start. Whether that dialogue is Eliot's dialogue, which is in fact a very disruptive dialogue with his own background, or whether in our cases we opened a different dialogue again with a formal background. The dialogue is always private, always subversive, always interior, and I think very much part of the poet's sort of DNA. And in my case, the dialogue with my own background was also obliquely with my history, my inheritance as an Irish poet.
Right. I was interested in object lessons, the glimpses I had of some of your ancestors, particularly the female ancestors, and I wondered, have you ever considered doing fiction, for example, using some of those people? I wanted to know more about them. I loved the beginnings of your imaginings of their lives.
Well, I've never written a word of fiction, and it's one of the few certainties I have that I never will. And, I think it's been very interesting to me in writing the prose. I mean, it's something you would know in Ireland. The past is not the same as history. And which is the more fictive, it would be hard to know. But I think it's one of the things I'm interested in, the fictive elements of memory.
Are there must be other Irish women poets that we haven't learned about yet in this country. Are they going to be starting to publish here? Is there anyone we should look for?
I hope so. I mean, there are wonderful Irish women poets. I mean, Maeve McGuckian and Nuala Ní Dhomhnaill, Paula Meehan, who has published here. I think, it's a big distance for people to cross to be the companion to the books they publish. But yes, I really do think there will be more.
Would you read the Pomegranate, which is one of my favorite poems?
Yes, I certainly will. This is just to register my surprise at having a child who turned into a teenager. And the poem is about the myth of Ceres, whose daughter is kidnapped, and she goes down to get her back from hell. And when she gets her back, that's the summer, and when she leaves her down there, that's the winter. The Pomegranate. The only legend I have ever loved is the story of a daughter lost in hell and found and rescued there. Love and blackmail are the gist of it. Ceres and Persephone the names. And the best thing about the legend is I can enter it anywhere and have. As a child in exile in a city of fogs and strange consonants, I read it first. And at first I was an exiled child in the crackling dusk of the underworld, the stars blighted. Later, I walked out in a summer twilight, searching for my daughter at bedtime. When she came running, I was ready to make any bargain to keep her. I carried her back past white beams and wasps and honey-scented buddleias. But I was Ceres then, and I knew winter was in store, for every leaf on every tree on that road was inescapable for each one we passed, and for me. It is winter and the stars are hidden. I climb the stairs and stand where I can see my child asleep beside her teen magazines, her can of Coke, her plate of uncut fruit. Pomegranate, how did I forget it? She could have come home and been safe and ended the story and all our heartbroken searching. But she reached out a hand and plucked a pomegranate. She put out her hand and pulled down the French sound for apple and the noise of stone and the proof that even in the place of death, at the heart of legend, in the midst of rocks full of unshed tears, ready to be diamonds, by the time the story was told, a child can be hungry. I could warn her, there is still a chance. The rain is cold, the road is flint-colored, the suburb has cars and cable television, the veiled stars are above ground. It is another world. But what else can a mother give her daughter but such beautiful rifts in time? If I defer the grief, I will diminish the gift. The legend must be hers as well as mine. She will enter it as I have. She will wake up. She will hold the papery, flushed skin in her hand and to her lips. I will say nothing.
It's a wonderful poem. Do either of your daughters write poetry, since you're married to a writer as well?
No, they don't write poetry, but they take an interest. They like to read it.
Right. And they like having parents who are writers?
Well, I think so. We don't press it too much on them.
Right. I found that different ages of my children, they loved it or they were embarrassed by it.
Yes.
It was interesting.
Yes.
What is it like being married to a writer? I'm married to a scientist, so I can't imagine living in a house with another writer.
Well, I mean, Kevin has a huge interest in fiction, and it's been a very important open window for me on a world I would have been very diffident in.
Thank you very much for being with us today.
Pleasure.
And thank you, the audience, for joining us. I'm Linda Pastan, and I've been speaking with Eavan Boland for The Writing Life.